Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this critical thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future critical thought topics. For today's critical thought, we're going to be talking about the topic of enemy behaviors in game design, or how a designer will come up with the ways for an enemy to challenge whoever is playing the game. Now, since the dawn of the video game era, game designers have used pattern-based or set enemy behaviors or set AI behaviors for their enemies. We have not gotten to the point where a game will have an AI that can actively read the situation and learn and grow through play. That would take us into, Skynet, Matrix territories, that kind of thing. The most we've gotten has been an AI that can essentially react to what the player is doing. Meaning if the player does A, the AI will try to respond with B, and so on and so forth. A good example of that would be the redesign of the AI for Supreme Commander 2. But that goes a little bit beyond my understanding, and we would probably need someone who has experience with designing that kind of AI to talk more about. For today's critical thought, I want to focus more on action games, or games where the player is specifically fighting enemies, be it grunts, lieutenants, bosses, stuff like that, and specifically with the action genre. And when it comes down to it, enemy behavior in these games is defined by patterns. A pattern is a selection of moves or options that the enemy will use in an attempt to defeat the player. This can be as simple as the ghost tracking Pac-Man in the arcade, to something as complex as having multiple patterns, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, in a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne. And when it comes to this kind of pattern design, it has been in just about every action-based video game imaginable, from ActRaiser to... I was trying to think of a good action game that began with the letter Z, but the only one that's coming to my mind is Zombies Ate My Neighbors. So, anyone watching this, if you have a action game that begins with Z, please let me know. But as we just said, when it comes to a pattern, this is essentially the enemy's command or what to use against the player. And these patterns are hard-coded. Now, in the old days, most characters had basically one pattern. One of the most infamous examples would be the Medusa head that would go like this in Castlevania. And despite being a simple pattern, it has killed a whole lot of players. And as design evolved, and of course things continue to grow over the decade or so, or I should say decades at this point, game designers have figured out ways of enhancing and mixing things up while still keeping to this kind of pattern-based behavior. And I want to talk about a few of these here. Now, what's very interesting is I wouldn't even know where to begin to look up any kind of technical or formal terms for what we're about to talk about. So for any of you who are designers right now, if someone actually has defined like a formal terminology, please let me know in the comments below, because I am very interested. Now, the first way of mixing things up when it comes to patterns is very simple. You add more patterns. If an enemy has 10 different possible attacks, well, that's harder for the player to learn than just one or two. Now, things get more and more interesting as we look at the different evolutions of action design. And the next part is lowering the pattern delay. Now, as I said, these patterns are hard-coded. If you program, let's say, an enemy in a fighting game, and they have a pattern of punch, punch, uppercut, something like that, that is going to be their main attack. And they're not going to change that pattern any which way. So what happens when there is a delay is essentially that brief window when the enemy is not doing anything. It could be seen as a cooldown after the attack, or the AI possibly trying to pick the next pattern to use. And the more explicit the delay is, the easier it is for the player to deal with it. Because if I know that after a punch-punch-kick combo, that the enemy just stands motionless for about half a second, that's the delay. So what you can do as a designer to make things more interesting is shorten that delay between patterns. So instead of maybe taking half a second, it may only take a quarter of a second, or hell, maybe even a tenth of a second. Now, the problem or the risk that you run into with trying to define your behavior like this is when patterns begin to bleed into each other. As in, the enemy finishes the combo, and then they immediately go into their next combo without any pause or any way for the player to effectively either get away from it or delay it. And what ends up happening is it can make things very difficult and sometimes frustrating to get through. From an example that I played recently would be the game A Whole New World, which we did a spotlight of on the channel a few months ago. The final boss fight is 100% a pattern-based example of a fight. And what happened was the delay between the patterns was so short that he does one attack, and I immediately do the move, I think it's a double jump, to get over it. And while I'm still coming down in the air, he immediately goes into his next pattern. And if he picks an attack that is like a dash or something, I can't properly dodge it while I'm still falling from the double jump action. So basically, I'm dodging one pattern to get hit by the next pattern. And that can be a little bit unfair. Another good example of this is actually from, of course, the classic game Super Mario Bros. The Hammer Brother enemies were one of the most annoying characters to fight in that game because how they threw those hammers meant that the patterns that they were putting out were basically running into each other. So they'll be throwing the hammers up in the air, and while you're waiting for him to come back down, he's already jumping in the air and performing another pattern. So you can't exactly jump over them because the first hammers are coming down. And you're kind of stuck in between patterns like that, waiting for that perfect moment of a break. Now, as we get further and we get into more of the complicated games like we've seen with action titles like God of War and of course the Soulsborne series, designers have figured out additional ways of getting more mileage out of this kind of pattern enemy behavior. Another such way is having conditional or randomized patterns. This is when instead of just going through 5 or 10 patterns one after another, the game will randomly pick between them. And we've been talking about that over the last few minutes. Again, the more you can shake up the patterns and prevent things from entering any kind of repetitive display for the player to learn, the harder it is for them to compensate. So, if the first time you fight a boss and he does an overhead swing, the next time you fight him, maybe he'll do a dash kick attack or something along those lines. And taking that one step further, we have positional based patterns. Now, this is something that we've really seen lately with the Soulsborne series. What happens is, let's say this is where I'm at, and this is where the boss is. Let me get my hands just right. So let's say at this distance, the boss has 5 possible patterns to use. Now, if we move a little bit closer, let's say we're this far away, now the boss has 4 patterns that he can use at this distance. And then when he is right in the smack dab in the middle, like this, let's say he has 8 or 9. Because at a close range where you're traditionally going to fight the enemy, this should be when he's going to be at his most reactive. And what happens in these cases is that a lot of the moves or a lot of these patterns are going to be designed for the boss to close the gap. Be it like a charging bash attack, a jump forward, anything like that. And this kind of creates the illusion that the boss is reacting to the player. In the sense that the boss is going to do an attack at long range, it's going to move him into the mid-range. Then he'll do, let's say, an attack that may hit you. Then he'll do another attack that moves him to close range, where he'll be at his most dangerous. Now again, from the outside looking in, it looks like the boss is just actively trying to engage the player. But really, they're just going through these patterns that are just kind of entering that perfect storm of doing the right pattern one after another. And if you want a good example of this kind of situation, again, the Soulsborne series is really great. When I fought Ludwig in Bloodborne, he has a very wide variety or wide assortment of patterns and attacks that he'll use at the different ranges. And a lot of the bosses is about, or the boss strategies, is about figuring out the best range to engage. And here's a great example of that from the Surge, which I hope you enjoyed my gauntlet of getting killed in that over the last few days. One of the bosses is with a humanoid enemy, who at close range will perform just a bunch of slow but devastating axe attacks. At mid-range, he'll do a slide, followed by one of two patterns. And this is the point where I realized that the boss was most vulnerable after those two patterns. So what I did during that fight was purposely keep within mid-range to force the AI to use that specific pattern, which I could then exploit and defeat. You can also see that during the Neo plays when I was fighting the various bosses. And you'll hear me while I'm playing these games that I'll count the number of swings, so I have kind of the idea that, okay, after swing number 4, he's vulnerable. And that kind of creates that mental map and potential strategy. Now, one of the final ways, and one of the most insidious ways that we've seen to mix things up, is having different patterns based on the same chain. Traditionally, when we look at enemy behaviors built on patterns, each pattern is its own separate entity. Meaning if I do punch, punch, uppercut, that's going to be different than uppercut, punch, punch. Both have different animation frames, both have different tells. And this started in my memory from Dark Souls 2. And if anyone can think of an earlier example of this, please let me know. In Dark Souls 2, what they started doing was saying one combo is, let's say, slash, slash, overhead slash. So in a traditional game or in older games, I would know at that overhead slash that I was safe to go in. What From Software did was base several different patterns on those same two slash slashes. So let's say another pattern would be slash slash and then shoulder rush punch kick. And then another one would be slash slash overhead slash and then two additional horizontal slashes. What this meant as the player was you couldn't just rely on simple memorization of these patterns, because each pattern had different chains or variations within them. So you had to be a lot more careful in terms of watching the enemy and understanding, okay, if he does this overhead slash, I need to wait a second to make sure that that's either the end, or if he'll go into a kick or a shoulder charge. And this basically threw the entire thing on its head. Because again, you couldn't just base yourself on just one pattern chain. You had to learn multiple ones. And even then, it became almost a guessing game of trying to figure out, okay, if he does this uppercut, do I go in now? Do I prepare a counterattack? Do I just try and dodge out of the way? And of course, this made things a lot more interesting and a lot more challenging to fight. Now, with that said, we're going to wrap things up. And today's critical thought, chances are if you're a game designer, everything that I just said you probably already know and probably even designed. But this is again one of those great topics for enthusiasts or people interested in studying design to kind of see behind the curtain of when it comes to playing a video game. Now, like I said at the start, when we're talking about strategy games, that, my friends, is a completely different echelon of design and AI. It has to do a lot with design conditionals and, again, an AI that can react. But that is, again, way beyond today's scope. And if you are a designer, especially someone who has worked on 4X or real-time strategy gameplay, and would like to share your thoughts, whether live or recorded on a cast, please let me know, because I would love to talk more about this topic. But to summarize, pattern-based or pattern enemy behaviors is pretty much a go-to for game designers. It allows them to design explicit commands and can be built to test the player in a variety of situations. And while the simple patterns we can talk about in older arcades and retro gaming, we can certainly see the evolution of that in modern action games. Again, if you look at the Soulsborne series, that's a really good example of the high end of enemy pattern behavior. When it comes to this kind of pattern design, speedrunners particularly love this. Because again, even though you can randomize it, you can make conditions, there are still set values or set actions. And if you've watched speedrunners play either action-based titles or retro games, they will usually talk about how they can exploit these patterns. Like I said a few minutes ago with the Surge example, if I know that in the, let's say, the long range, the enemy has a specific pattern or attack that leaves them incredibly vulnerable or easily exploited, then that's what I want to do to quickly end this fight. I don't want to fight the enemy at the range that it's most dangerous at or the hardest to counter. But figuring out what that is and when are the best times to go in are hallmarks of expert gameplay. And being able to design a game to properly test and reward the player is a great example of an exceptional game designer. Now, for those of you watching this, are there any good examples other than ones I've talked about that the game design really threw you for a loop in terms of the enemy behavior, be it through patterns or even something conditional or reactionary like we talk about strategy games? Let me know below. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you're new and you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know if you have any potential topics for future videos. And be sure to check back daily for more great discussions on design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And of course, share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GW for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.